The Dark Tower 2. The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. Argument. The Drawing of the Three is the second volume of a long tale called The Dark Tower, a tale inspired by and to some degree dependent upon Robert Browning's narrative poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which in its turn owes a debt to King Lear. The first volume, The Gunslinger, tells how Roland, the last gunslinger of a world which has moved on, finally catches up with the Man in Black, a sorcerer he has chased for a very long time. Just how long, we do not yet know. The Man in Black turns out to be a fellow named Walter, who falsely claimed the friendship of Roland's father in those days before the world moved on. Roland's goal is not this half-human creature, but the Dark Tower. The Man in Black, and more specifically what the Man in Black knows, is his first step on his road to that mysterious place. Who exactly is Roland? What was his world like before it moved on? What is the Tower, and why does he pursue it? We have only fragmentary answers. Roland is a gunslinger, a kind of knight, one of those charged with holding a world Roland remembers as being filled with love and light as it is, to keep it from moving on. We know that Roland was forced to an early trial of manhood after discovering that his mother had become the mistress of Martin, a much greater sorcerer than Walter, who, unknown to Roland's father, is Martin's ally. We know Martin has planned Roland's discovery, expecting Roland to fail and to be sent west. We know that Roland triumphs in his test. What else do we know? That the gunslinger's world is not completely unlike our own. Artifacts such as gasoline pumps and certain songs, Hey Jude, for instance, or the bit of doggerel that begins, Beans, beans, the musical fruit, have survived. So have customs and rituals oddly like those from our own romanticized view of the American West. And there is an umbilicus which somehow connects our world to the world of the gunslinger. At a way station on a long deserted coach road in a great and sterile desert, Roland meets a boy named Jake who died in our world. A boy who was, in fact, pushed from a street corner by the ubiquitous and iniquitous Man in Black. The last thing Jake, who was on his way to school with his book bag in one hand and his lunchbox in the other, remembers of his world, our world, is being crushed beneath the wheels of a Cadillac and dying. Before reaching the Man in Black, Jake dies again, this time because the gunslinger, faced with the second most agonizing choice of his life, elects to sacrifice this symbolic son. Given a choice between the Tower and Childe, possibly between damnation and salvation, Roland chooses the Tower. "Go then," Jake tells him before plunging into the abyss. "There are other worlds than these." The final confrontation between Roland and Walter occurs in a dusty Golgotha of decaying bones. The Dark Man tells Roland's future with a deck of tarot cards. These cards, showing a man called the Prisoner, a woman called the Lady of Shadows, and a darker shape that is simply death, but not for you, gunslinger, the Man in Black tells him, are prophecies which become the subject of this volume, and Roland's second step on the long and difficult path to the Dark Tower. The Gunslinger ends with Roland sitting upon the beach of the western sea watching the sunset. The Man in Black is dead, the gunslinger's own future course unclear. The Drawing of the Three begins on that same beach less than 7 hours later. Prologue. The Sailor. The gunslinger came awake from a confused dream which seemed to consist of a single image, that of the sailor in the tarot deck from which the Man in Black had dealt, or purported to deal, the gunslinger's own moaning future. "He drowns, gunslinger," the Man in Black was saying, "and no one throws out the line. The boy, Jake." But this was no nightmare. It was a good dream. It was good because he was the one drowning, and that meant he was not Roland at all, but Jake. And he found this a relief, because it would be far better to drown as Jake than to live as himself, a man who had for a cold dream betrayed a child who had trusted him. Good. All right, I'll drown, he thought, listening to the roar of the sea. Let me drown. But this was not the sound of the open deeps. It was the grating sound of water with a throat full of stones. Was he the sailor? If so, why was land so close? And in fact, was he not on the land? It felt as if freezing cold water doused his boots and ran up his legs to his crotch. His eyes flew open then, and what snapped him out of the dream wasn't his freezing balls, which had suddenly shrunk to what felt like the size of walnuts, nor even the horror to his right, but the thought of his guns. His guns, and even more important, his shells. Wet guns could be quickly disassembled, wiped dry, oiled, wiped dry again, oiled again, and reassembled. Wet shells, like wet matches, might or might not ever be usable again. The horror was a crawling thing which must have been cast up by a previous wave. It dragged a wet, gleaming body laboriously along the sand. It was about 4 feet long and about 4 yards to the right. It regarded Roland with bleak eyes on stalks. Its long, serrated beak dropped open, and it began to make a noise that was weirdly like human speech. Plaintive, even desperate questions in an alien tongue.
Did-a-chick, dum-a-chum, dad-a-cham, did-a-chick.
The gunslinger had seen lobsters. This wasn't one, although lobsters were the only things he had ever seen which this creature even vaguely resembled. It didn't seem afraid of him at all. The gunslinger didn't know if it was dangerous or not. He didn't care about his own mental confusion, his temporary inability to remember where he was or how he had gotten there, if he had actually caught the man in black or if all that had only been a dream. He only knew he had to get away from the water before it could drown his shells. He heard the grinding, swelling roar of water and looked from the creature. It had stopped dead and was holding up the claws with which it had been pulling itself along, looking absurdly like a boxer assuming his opening stance, which Court had taught them was called the honor stance, to the incoming breaker with its curdle of foam. It hears the wave, the gunslinger thought. Whatever it is, it's got ears. He tried to get up, but his legs, too numb to feel, buckled under him. I'm still dreaming, he thought. But even in his current confused state, this was a belief much too tempting to really be believed. He tried to get up again, almost made it, then fell back. The wave was breaking. There was no time again. He had to settle for moving in much the same way the creature on his right seemed to move. He dug in with both hands and dragged his butt up the stony shingle away from the wave. He didn't progress enough to avoid the wave entirely, but he got far enough for his purposes. The wave buried nothing but his boots. It reached almost to his knees and then retreated. Perhaps the first one didn't go as far as I thought. Perhaps there was a half-moon in the sky. A caul of mist covered it, but it shed enough light for him to see that the holsters were too dark. The guns, at least, had suffered a wetting. It was impossible to tell how bad it had been, or if either the shells currently in the cylinders or those in the crossed gun belts had also been wetted. Before checking, he had to get away from the water. Had to check. This was much closer. In his worry over the water, he had forgotten the creature the water had cast up. He looked around and saw it was now only 4 feet away. Its claws were buried in the stone and shell-littered sand of the shingle, pulling its body along. It lifted its meaty, serrated body, making it momentarily resemble a scorpion, but Roland could see no stinger at the end of its body. Another grinding roar, this one much louder. The creature immediately stopped and raised its claws into its own peculiar version of the honor stance again. This wave was bigger. Roland began to drag himself up the slope of the strand again, and when he put out his hands, the clawed creature moved with a speed of which its previous movements had not even hinted. The gunslinger felt a bright flare of pain in his right hand, but there was no time to think about that now. He pushed with the heels of his soggy boots, clawed with his hands, and managed to get away from the wave.
Did-a-chick,
the monstrosity inquired in its plaintive, "Won't you help me? Can't you see I'm desperate?" voice, and Roland saw the stumps of the first and second fingers of his right hand disappearing into the creature's jagged beak. It lunged again, and Roland lifted his dripping right hand just in time to save his remaining 2 fingers.
"Dum-a-chum, dad-a-chum."
The gunslinger staggered to his feet. The thing tore open his dripping jeans, tore through a boot whose old leather was soft but as tough as iron, and took a chunk of meat from Roland's lower calf. He drew with his right hand, and realized 2 of the fingers needed to perform this ancient killing operation were gone only when the revolver thumped to the sand. The monstrosity snapped at it greedily.
"No, bastard!"
Roland snarled and kicked it. It was like kicking a block of rock, one that bit. It tore away the end of Roland's right boot, tore away most of his great toe, tore the boot itself from his foot. The gunslinger bent, picked up his revolver, dropped it, cursed, and finally managed. What had once been a thing so easy it didn't even bear thinking about had suddenly become a trick akin to juggling. The creature was crouched on the gunslinger's boot, tearing at it as it asked its garbled questions. A wave rolled toward the beach, the foam which curdled its top looking pallid and dead in the netted light of the half-moon. The lobstrosity stopped working on the boot and raised its claws in that boxer's pose. Roland drew with his left hand and pulled the trigger 3 times. Click, click, click. Now he knew about the shells in the chambers, at least. He holstered the left gun. To holster the right, he had to turn its barrel downward with his left hand and then let it drop into its place. Blood slimed the worn ironwood hand grips. Blood spotted the holster and the old jeans to which the holster was thong-tied. It poured from the stumps where his fingers used to be. His mangled right foot was still too numb to hurt, but his right hand was a bellowing fire. The ghosts of talented and long-trained fingers, which were already decomposing in the digestive juices of that thing's guts, screamed that they were still there, that they were burning. "I see serious problems ahead," the gunslinger thought remotely. The wave retreated. The monstrosity lowered its claws, tore a fresh hole in the gunslinger's boot, and then decided the wearer had been a good deal more tasty than this bit of skin it had somehow sloughed off.
"Got a chum?"
it asked, and scurried toward him with ghastly speed. The gunslinger retreated on legs he could barely feel, realizing that the creature must have some intelligence. It had approached him cautiously, perhaps from a long way down the strand, not sure what he was or of what he might be capable. If the dousing wave hadn't wakened him, the thing would have torn off his face while he was still deep in his dream. Now it had decided he was not only tasty but vulnerable, easy prey. It was almost upon him, a thing 4 feet long and a foot high, a creature which might weigh as much as 70 pounds, and which was as single-mindedly carnivorous as David, the hawk he had had as a boy, but without David's dim vestige of loyalty. The gunslinger's left boot heel struck a rock jutting from the sand, and he tottered on the edge of falling.
"Got a chuck?"
the thing asked, solicitously it seemed, and peered at the gunslinger from its stalky, waving eyes as its claws reached. And then a wave came, and the claws went up again in the honor stance. Yet now they wavered the slightest bit, and the gunslinger realized that it responded to the sound of the wave, and now the sound was, for it at least, fading a bit. He stepped backward over the rock, then bent down as the wave broke upon the shingle with its grinding roar. His head was inches from the insectile face of the creature. One of its claws might easily have slashed the eyes from his face, but its trembling claws, so like clenched fists, remained raised to either side of its parrot-like beak. The gunslinger reached for the stone over which he had nearly fallen. It was large, half buried in the sand, and his mutilated right hand howled as bits of dirt and sharp edges of pebble ground into the open, bleeding flesh. But he yanked the rock free and raised it, his lips pulled away from his teeth.
"Dada!"
the monstrosity began, its claws lowering and opening as the wave broke and its sound receded, and the gunslinger swept the rock down upon it with all his strength. There was a crunching noise as the creature's segmented back broke. It lashed wildly beneath the rock, its rear half lifting and thudding, lifting and thudding. Its interrogatives became buzzing exclamations of pain. Its claws opened and shut upon nothing. Its maw of a beak gnashed up clots of sand and pebbles. And yet, as another wave broke, it tried to raise its claws again, and when it did, the gunslinger stepped on its head with his remaining boot. There was a sound like many small, dry twigs being broken. Thick fluid burst from beneath the heel of Roland's boot, splashing in two directions. It looked black. The thing arched and wriggled in a frenzy. The gunslinger planted his boot harder. A wave came. The monstrosity's claws rose an inch, 2 inches, trembled, and then fell, twitching open and shut. The gunslinger removed his boot. The thing's serrated beak, which had separated 2 fingers and 1 toe from his living body, slowly opened and closed. One antenna lay broken on the sand, the other trembled meaninglessly. The gunslinger stamped down again and again. He kicked the rock aside with a grunt of effort and marched along the right side of the monstrosity's body, stamping methodically with his left boot, smashing its shell, squeezing its pale guts out onto dark gray sand. It was dead, but he meant to have his way with it all the same. He had never in all his long, strange time been so fundamentally hurt, and it had all been so unexpected. He kept on until he saw the tip of one of his own fingers in the dead thing's sour mash, saw the white dust beneath the nail from the Golgotha where he and the man in black had held their long palaver. And then he looked aside and vomited. The gunslinger walked back toward the water like a drunken man, holding his wounded hand against his shirt, looking back from time to time to make sure the thing wasn't still alive, like some tenacious wasp you swat again and again and still twitches, stunned but not dead, to make sure it wasn't following, asking its alien questions in its deadly, despairing voice. Halfway down the shingle he stood, swaying, looking at the place where he had been, remembering. He had fallen asleep, apparently, just below the high tide line. He grabbed his purse and his torn boot. In the moon's glabrous light he saw other creatures of the same type, and in the caesura between one wave and the next heard their questioning voices. The gunslinger retreated, a step at a time, retreated until he reached the grassy edge of the shingle. There he sat down and did all he knew to do. He sprinkled the stumps of fingers and toe with the last of his tobacco to stop the bleeding, sprinkled it thick in spite of the new stinging. His missing great toe had joined the chorus, and then he only sat, sweating in the chill, wondering about infection, wondering how he would make his way in this world with 2 fingers on his right hand gone. When it came to the guns, both hands had been equal, but in all other things his right had ruled, wondering if the thing had some poison in its bite, which might already be working its way into him, wondering if morning would ever come. The Prisoner. Chapter 1. The Door. 1. 3. This is the number of your fate. 3? Yes, 3 is mystic. 3 stands at the heart of the mantra. Which 3? The first is dark-haired. He stands on the brink of robbery and murder. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is Heroin. Which demon is that? I know it not, even from nursery stories. He tried to speak, but his voice was gone. The voice of the oracle, star-slut, whore of the winds, both were gone. He saw a card fluttering down from nowhere to nowhere, turning and turning in the lazy dark. On it a baboon grinned from over the shoulder of a young man with dark hair. Its disturbingly human fingers were buried so deeply in the young man's neck that their tips had disappeared in flesh. Looking more closely, the gunslinger saw the baboon held a whip in one of those clutching, strangling hands. The face of the ridden man seemed to writhe in wordless terror. The prisoner, the man in black, who had once been a man the gunslinger trusted, a man named Walter, whispered chummily. A trifle upsetting, isn't he? A trifle upsetting, a trifle upsetting, a trifle. 2. The gunslinger snapped awake. waving at something with his mutilated hand, sure that in a moment one of the monstrous shelled things from the western sea would drop on him, desperately inquiring in its foreign tongue as it pulled his face off his skull. Instead, a seabird, attracted by the glister of the morning sun on the buttons of his shirt, wheeled away with a frightened squawk. Roland sat up. His hand throbbed wretchedly, endlessly. His right foot did the same. Both fingers and toe continued to insist they were there. The bottom half of his shirt was gone. What was left resembled a ragged vest. He had used one piece to bind his hand, the other to bind his foot. "Go away," he told the absent parts of his body. "You are ghosts now. Go away." It helped a little. Not much, but a little. They were ghosts, all right, but lively ghosts. The gunslinger ate jerky. His mouth wanted it little, his stomach less, but he insisted. When it was inside him, he felt a little stronger. There was not much left, though. He was nearly up against it. Yet things needed to be done. He rose unsteadily to his feet and looked about. Birds swooped and dived, but the world seemed to belong to only him and them. The monstrosities were gone. Perhaps they were nocturnal, perhaps tidal. At the moment it seemed to make no difference. The sea was enormous, meeting the horizon at a misty blue point that was impossible to determine. For a long moment the gunslinger forgot his agony in its contemplation. He had never seen such a body of water, had heard of it in children's stories, of course, had even been assured by his teachers, some at least, that it existed. But to actually see it, this immensity, this amazement of water, after years of arid land, was difficult to accept, difficult to even see. He looked at it for a long time, enwrapped, making himself see it, temporarily forgetting his pain in wonder. But it was morning, and there were still things to be done. He felt for the jawbone in his back pocket, careful to lead with the palm of his right hand, not wanting the stubs of his fingers to encounter it if it was still there, changing that hand's ceaseless sobbing to screams. It was. All right. Next. He clumsily unbuckled his gun belts and laid them on a sunny rock. He removed the guns, swung the chambers out, and removed the useless shells. He threw them away. A bird settled on the bright gleam tossed back by one of them, picked it up in its beak, then dropped it and flew away. The guns themselves must be tended to, should have been tended to before this. But since no gun in this world, or any other, was more than a club without ammunition, he laid the gun belts themselves over his lap before doing anything else, and carefully ran his left hand over the leather. Each of them was damp from buckle and clasp to the point where the belts would cross his hips. From that point, they seemed dry. He carefully removed each shell from the dry portions of the belts. His right hand kept trying to do this job, insisted on forgetting its reduction in spite of the pain, and he found himself returning it to his knee again and again, like a dog too stupid or fractious to heel. In his distracted pain, he came close to swatting it once or twice. "I see serious problems ahead," he thought again. He put these shells, hopefully still good, in a pile that was dishearteningly small. 20. Of those, a few would almost certainly miss fire. He could depend on none of them. He removed the rest and put them in another pile. 37. Well, you weren't heavy-loaded anyway, he thought. But he recognized the difference between 57 live rounds and what might be 20, or 10, or 5, or 1, or none. He put the dubious shells in a second pile. He still had his purse. That was one thing. He put it in his lap and then slowly disassembled his guns and performed the ritual of cleaning. By the time he was finished, 2 hours had passed, and his pain was so intense his head reeled with it. Conscious thought had become difficult. He wanted to sleep. He had never wanted that more in his life. But in the service of duty there was never any acceptable reason for denial. "Court," he said in a voice that he couldn't recognize, and laughed dryly. Slowly, he reassembled his revolvers and loaded them with the shells he presumed to be dry. When the job was done, he held the one made for his left hand, cocked it, and then slowly lowered the hammer again. He wanted to know, yes, wanted to know if there would be a satisfying report when he squeezed the trigger, or only another of those useless clicks. But a click would mean nothing, and a report would only reduce 20 to 19, or 9, or 3, or none. He tore away another piece of his shirt, put the other shells, the ones which had been wetted, in it, and tied it, using his left hand and his teeth. He put them in his purse. Sleep, his body demanded. Sleep, you must sleep now, before dark. There's nothing left, you're used up. He tottered to his feet and looked up and down the deserted strand. It was the color of an undergarment which has gone a long time without washing, littered with seashells which had no color. Here and there large rocks protruded from the gross-grained sand, and these were covered with guano, the older layers the yellow of ancient teeth, the fresher splotches white. The high tide line was marked with drying kelp. He could see pieces of his right boot and his water-skins lying near that line. He thought it almost a miracle that the skins hadn't been washed out to sea by high-surging waves. Walking slowly, limping exquisitely, the gunslinger made his way to where they were. He picked up one of them and shook it by his ear. The other was empty. This one still had a little water left in it. Most would not have been able to tell the difference between the two, but the gunslinger knew each just as well as a mother knows which of her identical twins is which. He had been traveling with these water-skins for a long, long time. Water sloshed inside. That was good, a gift. Either the creature which had attacked him or any of the others could have torn this or the other open with one casual bite or slice of claw, but none had, and the tide had spared it. Of the creature itself there was no sign, although the two of them had finished far above the tide line. Perhaps other predators had taken it. Perhaps its own kind had given it a burial at sea, as the elephants, giant creatures of whom he had heard in childhood stories, were reputed to bury their own dead. He lifted the water-skin with his left elbow, drank deeply, and felt some strength come back into him. The right boot was, of course, ruined, but then he felt a spark of hope. The foot itself was intact, scarred but intact, and it might be possible to cut the other down to match it, to make something which would last at least a while. Faintness stole over him. He fought it, but his knees unhinged and he sat down, stupidly biting his tongue. "You won't fall unconscious," he told himself grimly. "Not here, not where another of those things can come back tonight and finish the job." So he got to his feet and tied the empty skin about his waist, but he had only gone 20 yards back toward the place where he had left his guns and purse when he fell down again, half fainting. He lay there a while, one cheek pressed against the sand, the edge of a seashell biting against the edge of his jaw, almost deep enough to draw blood. He managed to drink from the water-skin, and then he crawled back to the place where he had awakened. There was a Joshua tree 20 yards up the slope. It was stunted, but it would offer at least some shade. To Roland, the 20 yards looked like 20 miles. Nonetheless, he laboriously pushed what remained of his possessions into that little puddle of shade. He lay there with his head in the grass, already fading toward what could be sleep or unconsciousness or death. He looked into the sky and tried to judge the time. Not noon, but the size of the puddle of shade in which he rested said noon was close. He held on a moment longer, turning his right arm over and bringing it close to his eyes, looking for the telltale red lines of infection, of some poison seeping steadily toward the middle of him. The palm of his hand was a dull red. Not a good sign. "I jerk off left-handed," he thought. "At least that's something." Then darkness took him, and he slept for the next 16 hours with the sound of the western sea pounding ceaselessly in his dreaming ears. 3. When the gunslinger awoke again, the sea was dark, but there was faint light in the sky to the east. Morning was on its way. He sat up, and waves of dizziness almost overcame him. He bent his head and waited. When the faintness had passed, he looked at his hand. It was infected, all right, a telltale red swelling that spread up the palm and to the wrist. It stopped there, but already he could see the faint beginnings of other red lines, which would lead eventually to his heart and kill him. He felt hot, feverish. "I need medicine," he thought, "but there is no medicine here." Had he come this far just to die, then? He would not. And if he were to die in spite of his determination, he would die on his way to the tower. "How remarkable you are, Gunslinger," the man in black tittered inside his head. "How indomitable, how romantic in your stupid obsession." "Fuck you," he croaked, and drank. Not much water left either. There was a whole sea in front of him for all the good it could do him. Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Never mind. He buckled on his gun belts, tied them. This was a process which took so long that before he was done the first faint light of dawn had brightened to the day's actual prologue, and then tried to stand up. He was not convinced he could do it until it was done. Holding to the Joshua tree with his left hand, he scooped up the not-quite-empty waterskin with his right arm and slung it over his shoulder. Then his purse. When he straightened, the faintness washed over him again, and he put his head down, waiting, willing. The faintness passed. Walking with the weaving, wavering steps of a man in the last stages of ambulatory drunkenness, the gunslinger made his way back down to the Strand. He stood looking at an ocean as dark as mulberry wine, and then took the last of his jerky from his purse. He ate half, and this time both mouth and stomach accepted a little more willingly. He turned and ate the other half as he watched the sun come up over the mountains where Jake had died, first seeming to catch on the cruel and treeless teeth of those peaks, then rising above them. Roland held his face to the sun, closed his eyes, and smiled. He ate the rest of his jerky. He thought, very well. I am now a man with no food, with 2 less fingers and 1 less toe than I was born with. I am a gunslinger with shells which may not fire. I am sickening from a monster's bite and have no medicine. I have a day's water if I'm lucky. I may be able to walk perhaps a dozen miles if I press myself to the last extremity. I am, in short, a man on the edge of everything. Which way should he walk? He had come from the east. He could not walk west without the powers of a saint or a savior. That left north and south. North. That was the answer his heart told. There was no question in it. North. The gunslinger began to walk. 4. He walked for 3 hours. He fell twice, and the second time he did not believe he would be able to get up again. Then a wave came toward him, close enough to make him remember his guns, and he was up before he knew it, standing on legs that quivered like stilts. He thought he had managed about 4 miles in those 3 hours. Now the sun was growing hot, but not hot enough to explain the way his head pounded, or the sweat pouring down his face. Nor was the breeze from the sea strong enough to explain the sudden fits of shuddering which sometimes gripped him, making his body lump into goose-flesh and his teeth chatter. "Fever, gunslinger," the man in black tittered. "What's left inside you has been touched afire." The red lines of infection were more pronounced now. They had marched upward from his right wrist halfway to his elbow. He made another mile and drained his water bag dry. He tied it around his waist with the other. The landscape was monotonous and unpleasing. The sea to his right, the mountains to his left, the gray, shell-littered sand under the feet of his cut-down boots. The waves came and went. He looked for the lobstrosities and saw none. He walked out of nowhere toward nowhere, a man from another time, who, it seemed, had reached a point of pointless ending. Shortly before noon he fell again, and knew he could not get up. This was the place, then. Here. This was the end, after all. On his hands and knees he raised his head like a groggy fighter, and some distance ahead, perhaps a mile, perhaps 3, it was difficult to judge distances along the unchanging reach of the strand, with the fever working inside him, making his eyeballs pulse in and out, he saw something new, something which stood upright on the beach. What was it? 3. Didn't matter. 3 is the number of your fate. The gunslinger managed to get to his feet again. He croaked something, some plea which only the circling seabirds heard, and how happy they would be to gobble my eyes from my head, he thought, how happy to have such a tasty bit, and walked on, weaving more seriously now, leaving tracks behind him that were weird loops and swoops. He kept his eyes on whatever it was that stood on the strand ahead. When his hair fell in his eyes, he brushed it aside. It seemed to grow no closer. The sun reached the roof of the sky, where it seemed to remain far too long. Roland imagined he was in the desert again, somewhere between the last outlander's hut, the musical fruit, the more you eat, the more you toot, and the way station where the boy, your Isaac, had awaited his coming. His knees buckled, straightened, buckled, straightened again. When his hair fell in his eyes once more, he did not bother to push it back, did not have the strength to push it back. He looked at the object, which now cast a narrow shadow back toward the upland, and kept walking. He could make it out now, fever or no fever. It was a door. Less than a quarter of a mile from it, Roland's knees buckled again, and this time he could not stiffen their hinges. He fell, his right hand dragged across gritty sand and shells. The stumps of his fingers screamed as fresh scabs were scored away. The stumps began to bleed again. So he crawled with the steady rush, roar, and retreat of the western sea in his ears. He used his elbows and his knees, digging grooves in the sand above the twist of dirty green kelp which marked the high tide line. He supposed the wind was still blowing. It must be, for the chills continued to whip through his body, but the only wind he could hear was the harsh gale which gusted in and out of his own lungs. The door grew closer. Closer. At last, around 3 o'clock of that long, delirious day, with his shadow beginning to grow long on his left, he reached it. He sat back on his haunches and regarded it wearily. It stood 6.5 feet high, and appeared to be made of solid ironwood, although the nearest ironwood tree must grow 700 miles or more from here. The doorknob looked as if it were made of gold, and it was filigreed with a design which the gunslinger finally recognized. It was the grinning face of the baboon. There was no keyhole in the knob, above it or below it. The door had hinges, but they were fastened to nothing. Or so it seems, the gunslinger thought. This is a mystery, a most marvelous mystery, but does it really matter? You are dying. Your own mystery, the only one that really matters to any man or woman in the end, approaches. All the same, it did seem to matter. This door where no door should be. It simply stood there on the gray strand, 20 feet above the high tide line, seemingly as eternal as the sea itself, now casting the slanted shadow of its thickness toward the east as the sun westered. Written upon it in black letters 2/3 of the way up, written in the high speech, were 2 words. The prisoner. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is heroin. The gunslinger could hear a low, droning noise. At first he thought it must be the wind, or a sound in his own feverish head, but he became more and more convinced that the sound was the sound of motors, and that it was coming from behind the door. Open it, then. It's not locked. You know it's not locked. Instead, he tottered gracelessly to his feet and walked above the door and around to the other side. There was no other side. Only the dark gray strand stretching back and back. Only the waves, the shells, the high tide line, the marks of his own approach, boot prints and holes that had been made by his elbows. He looked again, and his eyes widened a little. The door wasn't here, but its shadow was. He started to put out his right hand. Oh, it was so slow, learning its new place in what was left of his life, dropped it, and raised his left instead. He groped, feeling for hard resistance. If I feel it, I'll knock on nothing, the gunslinger thought. That would be an interesting thing to do before dying. His hand encountered thin air far past the place where the door, even if invisible, should have been. Nothing to knock on. And the sound of motors, if that's what it really had been, was gone. Now there was just the wind, the waves, and the sick buzzing inside his head. The gunslinger walked slowly back to the other side of what wasn't there, already thinking it had been a hallucination to start with. He stopped. At one moment he had been looking west at an uninterrupted view of a gray rolling wave, and then his view was interrupted by the thickness of the door. He could see its keyplate, which also looked like gold, with the latch protruding from it like a stubby metal tongue. Roland moved his head an inch to the north, and the door was gone. Moved it back to where it had been, and it was there again. It did not appear. It was just there. He walked all the way around and faced the door, swaying. He could walk around on the seaside, but he was convinced that the same thing would happen, only this time he would fall down. I wonder if I could go through it from the nothing side. Oh, there were all sorts of things to wonder about, but the truth was simple. Here stood this door alone on an endless stretch of beach, and it was for only one of two things: opening or leaving closed. The gunslinger realized with dim humor that maybe he wasn't dying quite as fast as he thought. If he had been, would he feel this scared? He reached out and grasped the doorknob with his left hand. Neither the deadly cold of the metal or the thin, fiery heat of the runes engraved upon it surprised him. He turned the knob. The door opened toward him when he pulled. Of all the things he might have expected, this was not any of them. The gunslinger looked, froze, uttered the first scream of terror in his adult life, and slammed the door. There was nothing for it to bang shut on, but it banged shut just the same, sending seabirds screeching up from the rocks on which they had perched to watch him. 5. What he had seen was the earth, from some high, impossible distance in the sky, miles up, it seemed. He had seen the shadows of clouds lying upon that earth, floating across it like dreams. He had seen what an eagle might see if one could fly thrice as high as any eagle could. To step through such a door would be to fall screaming for what might be minutes, and to end by driving oneself deep into the earth. No, you saw more. He considered it as he sat stupidly on the sand in front of the closed door, with his wounded hand in his lap. The first faint traceries had appeared above his elbow now. The infection would reach his heart soon enough, no doubt about that. It was the voice of Court in his head. Listen to me, maggots. Listen for your lives, for that's what it could mean someday. You never see all that you see. One of the things they send you to me for is to show you what you don't see in what you see. What you don't see when you're scared or fighting or running or fucking. No man sees all that he sees. But before you're gunslingers, those of you who don't go west, that is, you'll see more in one single glance than some men see in a lifetime. And some of what you don't see in that glance you'll see afterwards, in the eye of your memory, if you live long enough to remember, that is. Because the difference between seeing and not seeing can be the difference between living and dying. He had seen the earth from this huge height, and it had somehow been more dizzying and distorting than the vision of growth which had come upon him shortly before the end of his time with the man in black, because what he had seen through the door had been no vision. And what little remained of his attention had registered the fact that the land he was seeing was neither desert nor sea, but some green place of incredible lushness, with interstices of water that made him think it was a swamp. But what little remained of your attention, the voice of Court mimicked savagely. You saw more. Yes. He had seen white edges. "Bravo, Roland!" Court cried in his mind, and Roland seemed to feel the swat of that hard, calloused hand. He winced. He had been looking through a window. The gunslinger stood with an effort, reached forward, felt cold and burning lines of thin heat against his palm. He opened the door again. 6. The view he had expected, that view of the earth from some horrendous, unimaginable height, was gone. He was looking at words he didn't understand. He almost understood them. It was as if the great letters had been twisted. Above the words was a picture of a horseless vehicle, a motor car, of the sort which had supposedly filled the world before it moved on. Suddenly he thought of the things Jake had said when at the way station the gunslinger had hypnotized him. This horseless vehicle, with a woman wearing a fur stole laughing beside it, could be whatever had run Jake over in that strange other world. This is that other world, the gunslinger thought. Suddenly the view... It did not change, it moved. The gunslinger wavered on his feet, feeling vertigo and a touch of nausea. The words and the picture descended, and now he saw an aisle with a double row of seats on the far side. A few were empty, but there were men in most of them, men in strange dress. He supposed they were suits, but he had never seen any like them before. The things around their necks could likewise be ties or cravats, but he had seen none like these either. And so far as he could tell, not one of them was armed. He saw no dagger nor sword, let alone a gun. What kind of trusting sheep were these? Some read papers covered with tiny words broken here and there with pictures, while others wrote on papers with pens of a sort the gunslinger had never seen. But the pens mattered little to him. It was the paper. He lived in a world where paper and gold were valued in rough equivalency. He had never seen so much paper in his life. Even now, one of the men tore a sheet from the yellow pad which lay upon his lap and crumpled it into a ball, although he had only written on the top half of one side and not at all on the other. The gunslinger was not too sick to feel a twinge of horror and outrage at such unnatural profligacy. Beyond the men was a curved white wall and a row of windows. A few of these were covered by some sort of shutters, but he could see blue sky beyond others. Now a woman approached the doorway, a woman wearing what looked like a uniform, but of no sort Roland had ever seen. It was bright red, and part of it was pants. He could see the place where her legs became her crotch. This was nothing he had ever seen on a woman who was not undressed. She came so close to the door that Roland thought she would walk through, and he blundered back a step, lucky not to fall. She looked at him with the practiced solicitude of a woman who is at once a servant and no one's mistress but her own. This did not interest the gunslinger. What interested him was that her expression never changed. It was not the way you expected a woman, anybody for that matter, to look at a dirty, swaying, exhausted man with revolvers crisscrossed on his hips, a blood-soaked rag wrapped around his right hand, and jeans which looked as if they'd been worked on with some kind of buzzsaw. "Would you like?" the woman in red asked. There was more, but the gunslinger didn't understand exactly what it meant. Food or drink, he thought. That red cloth, it was not cotton. Silk? It looked a little like silk, but gin, a voice answered, and the gunslinger understood that. Suddenly, he understood much more. It wasn't a door. It was eyes. Insane as it might seem, he was looking at part of a carriage that flew through the sky. He was looking through someone's eyes. Whose? But he knew. He was looking through the eyes of the prisoner. Chapter 2. Eddie Dean. 1. As if to confirm this idea, mad as it was, what the gunslinger was looking at through the doorway suddenly rose and slid sidewards. The view turned, that feeling of vertigo again, a feeling of standing still on a plate with wheels under it, a plate which hands he could not see moved this way and that, and then the aisle was flowing past the edges of the doorway. He passed a place where several women, all dressed in the same red uniforms, stood. This was a place of steel things, and he would have liked to make the moving view stop in spite of his pain and exhaustion so he could see what the steel things were. Machines of some sort. One looked a bit like an oven. The army woman he had already seen was pouring the gin which the voice had requested. The bottle she poured from was very small. It was glass. The vessel she was pouring it into looked like glass, but the gunslinger didn't think it actually was. What the doorway showed had moved along before he could see more. There was another of those dizzying turns, and he was looking at a metal door. There was a lighted sign in a small oblong. This word the gunslinger could read. Vacant, it said. The view slid down a little. A hand entered it from the right of the door the gunslinger was looking through and grasped the knob of the door the gunslinger was looking at. He saw the cuff of a blue shirt, slightly pulled back to reveal crisp curls of black hair, long fingers, a ring on one of them, with a jewel set into it that might have been a ruby or a fire dim, or a piece of trumpery trash. The gunslinger rather thought this last. It was too big and vulgar to be real. The metal door swung open, and the gunslinger was looking into the strangest privy he had ever seen. It was all metal. The edges of the metal door flowed past the edges of the door on the beach. The gunslinger heard the sound of it being closed and latched. He was spared another of those giddy spins, so he supposed the man through whose eyes he was watching must have reached behind himself to lock himself in. Then the view did turn, not all the way around, but half, and he was looking into a mirror, seeing a face he had seen once before, on a tarot card. The same dark eyes and spill of dark hair. The face was calm but pale, and in the eyes through which he saw, now reflected back at him, Roland saw some of the dread and horror of that baboon-ridden creature on the tarot card. The man was shaking. He's sick, too. Then he remembered Nort, the weed-eater in Tull. He thought of the Oracle. A demon has infested him. The gunslinger suddenly thought he might know what heroin was after all, something like the devil grass. A trifle upsetting, isn't he? Without thought, with the simple resolve that had made him the last of them all, the last to continue marching on, long after Cuthbert and the others had died or given up, committed suicide or treachery, or simply recanted the whole idea of the tower, with a single-minded and incurious resolve that had driven him across the desert and all the years before the desert in the wake of the man in black, the gunslinger stepped through the doorway. 2. Eddie ordered a gin and tonic. Maybe not such a good idea to be going into New York Customs drunk, and he knew once he got started he would just keep on going, but he had to have something. When you gotta get down and you can't find the elevator, Henry had told him once, you gotta do it any way you can, even if it's only with a shovel. Then, after he'd given his order and the stewardess had left, he started to feel like he was maybe going to vomit. Not for sure going to vomit, only maybe, but it was better to be safe. Going through customs with a pound of pure cocaine under each armpit with gin on your breath was not so good. Going through customs that way with puke drying on your pants would be disaster. So better to be safe. The feeling would probably pass, it usually did, but better to be safe. Trouble was he was going cool turkey. Cool, not cold. More words of wisdom from that great sage and eminent junkie Henry Dean. They had been sitting on the penthouse balcony of the Regency Tower, not quite on the nod, but edging toward it, the sun warm on their faces, done up so good, back in the good old days, when Eddie had just started to snort the stuff, and Henry himself had yet to pick up his first needle. Everybody talks about going cold turkey, Henry had said, but before you get there, you gotta go cool turkey. And Eddie, stoned out of his mind, had cackled madly because he knew exactly what Henry was talking about. Henry, however, had not so much as cracked a smile. In some ways, cool turkey's worse than cold turkey. Henry said. "At least when you make it to cold turkey, you know you're going to puke. You know you're going to shake. You know you're going to sweat until it feels like you're drowning in it. Cool turkey is like the curse of expectation." Eddie remembered asking Henry what you called it when a needle freak, which in those dim, dead days, which must have been all of 16 months ago, they had both solemnly assured themselves they would never become, got a hot shot. "You call that baked turkey," Henry had replied promptly, and then had looked surprised, the way a person does when he said something that turned out to be a lot funnier than he actually thought it would be, and they looked at each other, and then they were both howling with laughter and clutching each other. Baked turkey. Pretty funny. Not so funny now. Eddie walked up the aisle, past the galley to the head, checked the sign, vacant, and opened the door. "Hey, Henry, oh great sage and eminent junkie big brother, while we're on the subject of our feathered friends, you want to hear my definition of cooked goose? That's when the customs guy at Kennedy decides there's something a little funny about the way you look. Or it's one of the days when they got the dogs with the PhD noses out there instead of at Port Authority, and they all start to bark and pee all over the floor, and it's you they're all just about strangling themselves in their choke chains trying to get to. And after the customs guys toss all your luggage, they take you into the little room and ask you if you'd mind taking off your shirt. And you say, yeah, I sure would. I'd mind like hell. I picked up a little cold down in the Bahamas, and the air conditioning here is real high, and I'm afraid it might turn into pneumonia. And they say, oh, is that so? Do you always sweat like that when the air conditioning's too high, Mr. Dean? You do? Well, excuse us all to hell. Now do it. And you do it, and they say, maybe you better take off the T-shirt, too, because you look like maybe you got some kind of a medical problem, buddy. Those bulges under your pits look like maybe they could be some kind of lymphatic tumors or something. And you don't even bother to say anything else. It's like a center fielder who doesn't even bother to chase the ball when it's hit a certain way. He just turns around and watches it go into the upper deck. Because when it's gone, it's gone. So you take off the T-shirt and, hey, looky here, you're some lucky kid. Those aren't tumors, unless they're what you might call tumors on the corpus of society. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Those things look more like a couple of baggies held there with Scotch strapping tape. And by the way, don't worry about that smell, son. That's just goose. It's cooked. He reached behind him and pulled the locking knob. The lights in the head brightened. The sound of the motors was a soft drone. He turned toward the mirror, wanting to see how bad he looked, and suddenly a terrible, pervasive feeling swept over him, a feeling of being watched. Hey, come on, quit it, he thought uneasily. You're supposed to be the most unparanoid guy in the world. That's why they sent you. That's why... But it suddenly seemed those were not his own eyes in the mirror, not Eddie Dean's hazel, almost green eyes that had melted so many hearts and allowed him to part so many pretty sets of legs during the last third of his 21 years. Not his eyes, but those of a stranger. Not hazel, but a blue, the color of fading Levi's. Eyes that were chilly, precise, unexpected marvels of calibration, bombardier's eyes. Reflected in them, he clearly saw a seagull, swooping down over a breaking wave and snatching something from it. He had time to think, what in God's name is this shit? And then he knew it wasn't going to pass. He was going to throw up after all. In the half-second before he did, in the half-second he went on looking into the mirror, he saw those blue eyes disappear. But before that happened, there was suddenly the feeling of being two people, of being possessed, like the little girl in The Exorcist. Clearly, he felt a new mind inside his own mind, and heard a thought not as his own thought, but more like a voice from a radio. I've come through. I'm in the sky carriage. There was something else, but Eddie didn't hear it. He was too busy throwing up into the basin as quietly as he could. When he was done, before he had even wiped his mouth, something happened which had never happened to him before. For one frightening moment, there was nothing, only a blank interval, as if a single line in a column of newsprint had been neatly and completely inked out. What is this? Eddie thought helplessly. What the hell is this shit? Then he had to throw up again, and maybe that was just as well. Whatever you might say against it, Regurgitation had at least this much in its favor. As long as you were doing it, you couldn't think of anything else. 3. I've come through. I'm in the sky carriage, the gunslinger thought. And a second later, he sees me in the mirror. Roland pulled back. Did not leave, but pulled back, like a child retreating to the furthest corner of a very long room. He was inside the sky carriage. He was also inside a man who was not himself. Inside the prisoner. In that first moment, when he had been close to the front, it was the only way he could describe it, he had been more than inside. He had almost been the man. He felt the man's illness, whatever it was, and sensed that the man was about to retch. Roland understood that if he needed to, he could take control of this man's body. He would suffer his pains, would be ridden by whatever demon ape rode him, but if he needed to, he could. Or he could stay back here, unnoticed. When the prisoner's fit of vomiting had passed, the gunslinger leaped forward, this time all the way to the front. He understood very little about this strange situation, and to act in a situation one does not understand is to invite the most terrible consequences, but there were two things he needed to know, and he needed to know them so desperately that the needing outweighed any consequences which might arise. Was the door he had come through from his own world still there? And if it was his physical self still there, collapsed, untenanted, perhaps dying or already dead without his self to go on unthinkingly running lungs and heart and nerves? Even if his body still lived, it might only continue to do so until night fell. Then the lobstrosities would come out to ask their questions and look for shore dinners. He snapped the head which was for a moment his head around in a fast backward glance. The door was still there, still behind him. It stood open on his own world, its hinges buried in the steel of this peculiar privy. And yes, there he lay, Roland, the last gunslinger, lying on his side, his bound right hand on his stomach. I'm breathing, Roland thought. I'll have to go back and move me. But there are things to do first. Things... He let go of the prisoner's mind and retreated, watching, waiting to see if the prisoner knew he was there or not. 4. After the vomiting stopped, Eddie remained bent over the basin, eyes tightly closed. Blanked there for a second. Don't know what it was. Did I look around? He groped for the faucet and ran cool water. Eyes still closed, he splashed it over his cheeks and brow. When it could be avoided no longer, he looked up into the mirror again. His own eyes looked back at him. There were no alien voices in his head, no feeling of being watched. You had a momentary fugue, Eddie, the great sage and eminent junkie advised him, a not uncommon phenomenon in one who was going cool turkey. Eddie glanced at his watch. An hour and a half to New York. The plane was scheduled to land at 4:05 EDT, but it was really going to be high noon, showdown time. He went back to his seat. His drink was on the divider. He took 2 sips, and the stew came back to ask him if she could do anything else for him. He opened his mouth to say no, and then there was another of those odd, blank moments. 5. I'd like something to eat, please, the gunslinger said through Eddie Dean's mouth. We'll be serving a hot snack, and I'm really starving, though, the gunslinger said with perfect truthfulness. Anything at all, even a popkin. Popkin? The army woman frowned at him, and the gunslinger suddenly looked into the prisoner's mind. Sandwich. The word was as distant as the murmur in a conch shell. A sandwich, even, the gunslinger said. The army woman looked doubtful. Well, I have some tuna fish. That would be fine, the gunslinger said, although he had never heard of tuna fish in his life. Beggars could not be choosers. You do look a little pale, the army woman said. I thought maybe it was air sickness. Pure hunger. She gave him a professional smile. I'll see what I can rustle up. Rustle? the gunslinger thought dazedly. In his own world, to rustle was a slang verb meaning to take a woman by force. Never mind, food would come. He had no idea if he could carry it back through the doorway to the body which needed it so badly, but one thing at a time, one thing at a time. Rustle, he thought, and Eddie Dean's head shook as if in disbelief. Then the gunslinger retreated again. 6. Nerves, the great oracle and eminent junkie assured him. Just nerves, all part of the cool turkey experience, little brother. But if nerves was what it was, how come he felt this odd sleepiness stealing over him? Odd because he should have been itchy, ditzy, feeling that urge to squirm and scratch that came before the actual shakes. Even if he had not been in Henry's cool turkey state, there was the fact that he was about to attempt bringing 2 pounds of coke through U.S. Customs, a felony punishable by not less than 10 years in federal prison, and he seemed to suddenly be having blackouts as well. Still, that feeling of sleepiness. He sipped at his drink again, then let his eyes slip shut. Why'd you black out? I didn't. Or she'd be running for all the emergency gear they carry. Blanked out, then. It's no good either way. You never blanked out like that before in your life. Nodded out, yeah, but never blanked out. Something odd about his right hand, too. It seemed to throb vaguely, as if he had pounded it with a hammer. He flexed it without opening his eyes. No ache, no throb, no blue bombardier's eyes. As for the blankouts, they were just a combination of going cool turkey and a good case of what the great oracle and eminent etc. would no doubt call the smuggler's blues. But I'm going to sleep just the same, he thought. How about that? Henry's face drifted by him like an untethered balloon. Don't worry, Henry was saying. You'll be all right, little brother. You'll fly down there to Nassau, check in at the Aquinas. There'll be a man come by Friday night, one of the good guys. He'll fix you, leave you enough stuff to take you through the weekend. Sunday night he brings a Coke and you give him the key to the safe deposit box. Monday morning you do the routine, just like Balazar said. This guy will play. He knows how it's supposed to go. Monday noon you fly out, and with a face as honest as yours, you'll breeze through customs and we'll be eating steak and sparks before the sun goes down. It's going to be a breeze, little brother. Nothing but a cool breeze. But it had been sort of a warm breeze after all. The trouble with him and Henry was they were like Charlie Brown and Lucy. The only difference was once in a while Henry would hold on to the football so Eddie could kick it. Not often, but once in a while. Eddie had even thought while in one of his heroin dazes that he ought to write Charles Schultz a letter. Dear Mr. Schultz, he would say, you're missing a bet by always having Lucy pull the football up at the last second. She ought to hold it down there once in a while. Nothing Charlie Brown could ever predict, you understand. Sometimes she'd maybe hold it down for him to kick 3, even 4 times in a row, then nothing for a month, then once, and then nothing for 3 or 4 days, and then, you get the idea. That would really fuck the kid up, wouldn't it? Eddie knew it would really fuck the kid up. From experience, he knew it. One of the good guys, Henry had said, but the guy who showed up had been a sallow-skinned thing with a British accent, a hairline mustache that looked like something out of a 1940s film noir, and yellow teeth that all leaned inward, like the teeth of a very old animal trap. You have the key, Signor? He asked. Except in that British public school accent, it came out sounding like what you called your last year of high school. The key's safe, Eddie said, if that's what you mean. Then give it to me. That's not the way it goes. You're supposed to have something to take me through the weekend. Sunday night, you're supposed to bring me something. I give you the key. Monday, you go into town and use it to get something else. I don't know what, 'cause that's not my business. Suddenly, there was a small, flat blue automatic in the sallow-skinned thing's hand. Why don't you just give it to me, Signor? I will save time and effort. You will save your life. There was deep steel in Eddie Dean, junkie or no junkie. Henry knew it. More important, Balazar knew it. That was why he had been sent. Most of them thought he had gone because he was hooked through the bag and back again. He knew it, Henry knew it, Balazar too. But only he and Henry knew he would have gone even if he was as straight as a stake. For Henry. Balazar hadn't got quite that far in his figuring, but fuck Balazar. Why don't you just put that thing away, you little scuzz? Eddie asked. Or do you maybe want Balazar to send someone down here and cut your eyes out of your head with a rusty knife? The sallow thing smiled. The gun was gone like magic. In its place was a small envelope. He handed it to Eddie. "Just a little joke, you know." "If you say so." "I'll see you Sunday night." He turned toward the door. "I think you better wait." The sallow thing turned back, eyebrows raised. "You think I won't go if I want to go?" "I think if you go and this is bad shit, I'll be gone tomorrow, then you'll be in deep shit." The sallow thing turned sulky. It sat in the room's single easy chair while Eddie opened the envelope and spilled out a small quantity of brown stuff. It looked evil. He looked at the sallow thing. "I know how it looks. It looks like shit, but that's just the cut," the sallow thing said. "It's fine." Eddie tore a sheet of paper from the notepad on the desk and separated a small amount of the brown powder from the pile. He fingered it and then rubbed it on the roof of his mouth. A second later, he spat into the wastebasket. "You want to die? Is that it? You got a death wish?" "That's all there is." The sallow thing looked more sulky than ever. "I have a reservation out tomorrow," Eddie said. This was a lie, but he didn't believe the sallow thing had the resources to check it. "TWA. I did it on my own, just in case a contact happened to be a fuck-up like you. I don't mind. It'll be a relief, actually. I wasn't cut out for this sort of work." The sallow thing sat and cogitated. Eddie sat and concentrated on not moving. He felt like moving, felt like slipping and sliding, bipping and bopping, shucking and jiving, scratching his scratches and cracking his crackers. He even felt his eyes wanting to slide back to the pile of brown powder, although he knew it was poison. He had fixed at 10 that morning. The same number of hours had gone by since then. But if he did any of those things, the situation would change. The sallow thing was doing more than cogitating. It was watching him, trying to calculate the depth of him. "I might be able to find something," it said at last. "Why don't you try?" Eddie said. "But come 11, I turn out the light and put the Do Not Disturb sign on the door. And anybody that knocks after I do that, I call the desk and say someone's bothering me, send a security guy." "You are a fuck," the sallow thing said in its impeccable British accent. "No," Eddie said. "A fuck is what you expected. I came with my legs crossed. You want to be here before 11 with something that I can use. It doesn't have to be great, just something I can use, or you will be one dead scuzz."